The door is the part nobody can prove. Not the disagreement, not the tension, the door. Because the most explosive version of this story says Prince William got up, ended the conversation, and walked out after King Charles made a family decision his heir could not accept. There's just one problem. Buckingham Palace has never publicly confirmed that scene. No official statement says William stormed out. No palace record describes some dramatic confrontation. No named witness has put themselves inside that room. But here's what makes this uncomfortable. Charles has now made a very real move that could explain why stories about a father-son collision suddenly don't sound completely impossible. And once you see what happened on July 10, what's happening around Balmoral now, and where Prince Edward quietly fits into all of it, the alleged walkout almost becomes the least important part, because Charles appears to be drawing one line around his family. William may be drawing another, and sooner or later, only one of those lines survives. On July 10, 2026, something happened at Highgrove that would have sounded almost impossible a year earlier. Prince Harry arrived. But he wasn't alone. Meghan was there. Archie was there. Lilibet was there. King Charles and Queen Camilla met them privately at Highgrove, with Reuters reporting that it was the first time Charles had seen Archie and Lilibet since 2022. The palace described it as a private family occasion and said there would be no photographs, video, or further details. Read that last part again. Private. Family. Not royal duty. Not constitutional business. Family. That distinction is about to become very important, because one person was conspicuously absent from the reunion, William. And suddenly the question changed. It was no longer, will Charles ever see Harry again? That question had just been answered. The new question was far more dangerous. What happens if Charles decides he wants Harry back in his private family life before William is ready to forgive him? There it is. That's the fracture. Not necessarily screaming across a table. Something colder. A king who is still a father. An heir who is already thinking like the next king. And Harry standing between them. Harry had publicly said before that he wanted reconciliation with his family. In May 2025, he said, "I would love reconciliation with my family." For months, that sounded like a wish. Then, Highgrove happened. Charles didn't issue some grand declaration. He did something more revealing. He opened the door. But opening a door for your son is not the same thing as reopening the palace gates for a Duke of Sussex. That is where people keep getting this story wrong. And that is where William suddenly matters. Because William doesn't merely have an opinion about what happens next. He has a deadline. One nobody can move. Eventually, Charles's reign ends. Eventually, William becomes king. So imagine the problem. Charles repairs the relationship now. Harry visits more often. Archie and Lilibet spend more time with their grandfather. Christmas becomes possible. Balmoral becomes imaginable. Private family events stop feeling impossible. Then one day, the crown passes to William. What happens then? Because reconciliation with Charles does not automatically mean reconciliation with William. In fact, reports surrounding the July reunion continue to describe William and Harry's relationship as deeply fractured. Publicly, there has been no comparable brother-to-brother reunion, which creates a bizarre situation. Harry may be moving closer to the monarchy's current head while remaining estranged from the man who will become its next head. Wait. What? Exactly. That is why the William walked out claim gets attention. Not because we can verify that he literally walked out of some secret meeting. We can't. But because the underlying disagreement people are attaching to that scene is no longer difficult to imagine. Charles can ask one question. Can I have my son back? William has to ask another. What does this mean when I'm king? Those are not the same question. And then, almost unnoticed, Balmoral shut its gates. On August 9, 2026, Balmoral Castle closed to the public as the royal family's traditional private summer period began. Members of the family are expected around the Scottish estate during the late summer gathering. Perfect setting for the rumor machine. No cameras inside, no microphones, no court circular describing breakfast conversations, just stone walls, private cottages, long drives, family dinners, and enough silence for everyone outside those gates to invent whatever they want. But something else is happening at exactly the same time. Prince Edward's family is becoming more interesting, not less. Edward has spent years doing something that doesn't generate nearly as many dramatic headlines as Harry or William. Showing up, representing the king, taking on overseas duties, attending national occasions, carrying out the kind of work a slimmed-down monarchy still desperately needs somebody to do. The official royal family website describes the Duke of Edinburgh as supporting the king in his role as head of state, including representing Charles at events in Britain and abroad. That sounds ordinary. It isn't. Because Charles has fewer working royals to rely on than Queen Elizabeth did. Harry is out. Andrew is out. The Waleses have their own enormous responsibilities. Anne cannot carry everything forever. So Edward sits in a strange position. He isn't the heir. He isn't the scandal. He isn't usually the headline. But remove him from the board, and suddenly the board looks a lot emptier. Then Charles made a decision back in 2023 that looks even more interesting now. He gave Edward the Dukedom of Edinburgh, Prince Philip's old title. That was emotional enough. But there was a catch. A huge one. The palace explicitly announced that Edward would hold the title for his lifetime, not as some automatic permanent dynasty for Edward's descendants. For Edward, for life. So if somebody tells you Edward has secretly secured some unstoppable hereditary royal empire, stop right there. The public record says something much more subtle. Charles elevated Edward, but he also contained the elevation. Honor the brother. Preserve Philip's legacy. Use Edward as a senior working royal. But do not automatically create another permanent branch carrying that dukedom generation after generation. That isn't generosity without limits. That's architecture. And now look at Edward's son. James, Earl of Wessex, turned 18. This week, Buckingham Palace confirmed that James is heading to the Royal Agricultural University to study rural land and property management. But before university, he has reportedly been working on Charles's Sandringham estate, not posing beside a tractor for a ceremonial photograph, working as a farmhand, driving machinery, getting his hands dirty. Then comes the detail that changes everything. Despite being eligible to use a princely style through his royal lineage, reporting this week indicates James is continuing as Earl of Wessex rather than stepping forward into life as a senior working prince. Think about what that means. While people online are screaming about who supposedly inherits everything, one of the youngest adult members of the family appears to be heading in exactly the opposite direction. University. Land management. A quieter life. No dramatic grab for a front-row royal role. And suddenly, Edward's position looks different too. Maybe the important thing Edward receives isn't some mystery palace. Maybe it's responsibility. A place beside Charles during a transition period. A title tied to his own lifetime. A role that strengthens the monarchy now, without guaranteeing his children a permanent future inside the working institution. That's a much bigger decision than handing someone keys to another mansion. And if you're already seeing where this is going, subscribe, because the next part is where Charles, William, and Edward stop looking like three separate royal stories. They become one. Because while all of this was happening, the money became public. Very public. In June, Britain's National Audit Office put royal property arrangements under a level of scrutiny the family rarely experiences. The report examined leases and housing involving several members of the royal family, including arrangements connected to Prince Edward. Reuters reported that some royal leases involved negligible or unusually low rents, while the wider review exposed just how complicated royal property arrangements actually are. Now you would think this is where the giant secret inheritance appears. The hidden estate, the document nobody knew existed, the property Edward supposedly walks away with while everyone else stares in disbelief. Except that isn't what the evidence shows. Edward's Bagshot Park arrangement has been discussed publicly for years. His long lease involved a substantial premium, with later peppercorn rent terms. Complicated? Absolutely. Secret inheritance from Charles? That's a completely different claim. And there's another twist. William doesn't need to fight Edward over Charles's private pocketbook to establish his position. William already controls something enormous. The Duchy of Cornwall. Reuters reported that the duchy was valued at roughly £1.2 billion and produced £21.55 million for William in the 2025-26 financial year. Charles, meanwhile, receives personal income through the Duchy of Lancaster. 2 men, 2 financial structures, 2 increasingly distinct centers of royal gravity. Father and son are not simply sitting around waiting to divide the same pile of money. William already has institutional independence. That matters, because it means disagreement doesn't require rebellion. He doesn't need to slam a fist on the table. He doesn't need to shout. He doesn't even need to win every argument today. Time itself is moving power toward him. Every year Charles gets older. Every year George gets older. Every year William becomes less like the prince waiting behind his father and more like a monarch whose reign is already being mentally constructed. And that is precisely why Harry becomes such a difficult question. Charles is looking backward as a father. William has to look forward as a king. Charles sees a son he has barely seen, grandchildren he had not seen since 2022. Years that cannot be returned. William sees something else. Trust, institutional risk, the consequences of whatever happens after Charles is gone. Same family, completely different clocks. Now put Edward in the middle. Edward doesn't threaten William's succession. He strengthens the current reign. He gives Charles another experienced working royal. He carries Philip's title for his lifetime. His children are not being aggressively pushed toward full-time royal careers. He is useful to Charles without creating an obvious rival structure to William. That may be the safest relationship in the entire family. Which raises the question nobody asks. What if the final family decision isn't actually about choosing Edward over William? What if it's about dividing the family into 3 completely different categories? Those who carry the monarchy, those who remain family, and those who will inherit its future. Edward carries it. Harry may be allowed back into the family. William inherits the future. 3 men, 3 lanes. Suddenly the chaos starts to look almost deliberate. But there's still one problem. Harry doesn't fit neatly into a lane. Because once somebody starts returning as family, people immediately ask whether something more follows. A Christmas invitation? Balmoral? Royal accommodation? Security? Public appearances? A ceremonial role? That is where Charles's private forgiveness could eventually collide with William's institutional caution. Not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But the door is there now. And Charles opened it at Highgrove. This is why the July 10th meeting matters so much. The palace did not turn Harry back into a working royal that afternoon. There was no announcement of restored duties, no new patronages, no balcony declaration, no constitutional transformation. Charles did something simultaneously smaller and more powerful. He separated the man from the job. Harry the working royal can remain outside. Harry the son can come through the door. That distinction gives Charles room to reconcile without rewriting the monarchy. But it gives William something too. Because one day, William may be able to say exactly the same thing. Brother? Perhaps. Working royal? Different question. and suddenly the entire alleged argument changes shape. If William really objected to Charles moving closer to Harry, he wouldn't necessarily need to stop his father. He could simply refuse to attach the future reign to the decision. That's colder than a walkout, because walking out is emotional. Waiting is power, and William can wait. There is another reason he can. The succession itself is not a family vote. Charles cannot gather everybody around a Balmoral table and simply decide Edward becomes king instead. The official royal family explanation of succession makes clear that succession is governed by law and parliament. So strip away the internet theater for a second. Charles can decide whom he forgives. He can influence roles. He can grant honors. He can make private arrangements concerning his own property. But the crown is not a Christmas present. William's place in the succession is not dependent on winning an argument with his father, which means the alleged moment where William walks out becomes almost ironic. If such a disagreement ever did happen, William would be the one man in the room who could afford to leave, because his future position does not disappear when the door closes behind him. Wait, there's one final twist. Edward's future demonstrates exactly how Charles seems to think about these things. Charles gave his brother a tremendous honor, Duke of Edinburgh, but the announcement put a boundary around it. Edward's lifetime. Then look at James, 18 years old, royal blood, a title already available to him. Yet the immediate public story is university and land management, not preparations for a lifetime of royal duty. That is not a monarchy expanding. It is a monarchy deciding very carefully who actually needs to remain inside the machine. So perhaps Charles's final decision has been visible for years. Family can be large, the institution cannot. That is the rule that makes everything else make sense. Edward stays close because Edward works. Sophie stays close because Sophie works. William stays central because William is the heir. George waits behind him because George is next in line. Harry can potentially move closer as a son without automatically moving closer as a working prince. Those are two completely different journeys. And if William doesn't like how far the first journey goes, he doesn't have to destroy his father's reconciliation. He just has to decide where the second journey stops when the crown reaches him. That is the part Charles cannot settle forever, because there are really two royal courts now. The court Charles controls today, and the one quietly forming around William's tomorrow. Most of the time they overlap. Same ceremonies, same balcony, same family photographs, same national duties. But underneath that, different instincts, different wounds, different memories, different ideas of who can be trusted. And Harry is standing directly on that fault line. Edward isn't. That may be Edward's greatest advantage of all. He didn't inherit William's destiny. He didn't create Harry's problem. He doesn't carry Andrew's baggage. He occupies the rarest place inside this family, useful without being threatening, close without being central, royal without being the future king. Which brings us back to that door. Did William literally stand up during some secret family showdown and walk out? There is no public confirmation that he did. But the more important question was never whether William left a room. It was whether Charles has made a family choice William refuses to carry into his own reign. Highgrove gave us the first clue. Harry came through Charles's door. Balmoral may give the family privacy to work out what happens next. Edward's position shows what Charles rewards. James's path shows what the monarchy is trying not to create. And William doesn't need Charles to announce his future. His future is already waiting for him. So picture the final scene. Balmoral. The gates closed. Charles inside the estate, 77 years old, trying to hold together pieces of a family that have spent years moving apart. Edward still doing the work. Harry testing whether the road home actually exists. William knowing that every decision Charles makes now will eventually arrive on his desk in one form or another. One father can open a door. One king can decide who enters his private life. But he cannot order the next king to keep that door open. And that may be the real family decision nobody at Balmoral can make for William. If you think Charles has every right to rebuild the relationship with Harry, even without William's blessing, say so below. But if you think William should be allowed to draw a completely different line when his reign begins, say that too. Because sooner or later, the door Charles has opened